A decisive spear throw from Teresa turns their encounter into a fateful moment. Can love begin from war? What if the love of your life came from a place you could never understand? A world so far away, it might as well be another universe, or a distant star. What if, in your wildest dreams, you met someone who wasn't human? Would you dare to love them, or would their very existence shatter everything you believed in? Imagine, waking up alone on an alien planet, dust swirling in the air, the crimson sands stretching for miles. You think you're the only one left, until you see something or someone you never expected, a figure standing at the edge of the horizon, someone with eyes glowing like embers and skin the color of starlight, her gaze locking with yours. Can you even begin to imagine how it feels to be drawn toward a creature from another world, someone whose very existence might contradict everything you thought you knew about love? And yet, somehow, you can't look away. But here's the truth, this isn't just a love story. This is the story of whether two hearts, one human, one alien, can bridge the gap between worlds, between species, and even across the universe itself. Can love survive when it has to break every boundary, defy every law, and make the impossible, possible? But the real question is, what happens when survival isn't enough? Stay with me, because what you're about to witness isn't just an adventure. It's the beginning of a journey that will test everything you believe about love, about survival, and about the universe itself. Before we dive into this cosmic adventure, if this mystery has already caught your attention, don't wait. Like this video, subscribe, and join us on this intergalactic journey. You won't want to miss a single moment. The story you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about love, and the universe. Kyle slowly opens his eyes, feeling dizzy and aching in every muscle. Pain shoots through his body as he tries to move, his hands bracing against the wreckage of his ship scattered around him. Dust and debris swirl in the air, and the horizon is covered in an ominous red haze. The first thing Kyle notices is the sky, an eerie shade of crimson. It's nothing like the Earth sky, and it sets the tone of the alien world around him. He's lying in a wrecked spacecraft, surrounded by metal scraps, with only faint gusts of wind whipping through the wreckage. The sandstorm is coming. He doesn't have much time. Kyle struggles to rise, his legs weak from the crash, his head spinning. He glances around at the wreckage. The crew members are gone, and it's clear that the planet's conditions have already begun to take their toll. Damn it, I've been left behind, Kyle mutters to himself, his voice hoarse from the dry air. But there's no time to dwell on it. The sandstorm is coming, and if he doesn't act now, he's not going to make it out of this alive. Suddenly, Kyle hears something. A disturbance, a figure emerging from the distance. A woman, tall, graceful, with platinum white hair blowing in the wind, and golden eyes staring directly at him. She's not human. Kyle immediately senses danger. She's a warrior. Her posture is calm, confident, and she holds a spear, the tip glinting in the harsh sunlight. She steps forward, eyes locked on Kyle, not a word spoken between them. The silence is filled with tension. Kyle instinctively grabs for a weapon, but he doesn't have one. He's unarmed. He raises his arm slowly, as though trying to show peace. Without warning, the woman lunges forward, spear raised high, and Kyle's heart skips a beat. The point of the spear aims directly at his chest, the force of it swift and decisive. Kyle's body reacts before his mind can process. His combat training kicks in, and in an instant, his hands shoot out, grasping the shaft of the spear, just inches from his chest. The impact nearly knocks him backward, but Kyle holds on, feeling the sharp pain in his palms as the splinters of the spear bite into his skin. He doesn't let go. The spear's momentum halts, and the world goes still for a moment. The warrior stands motionless, her golden eyes wide with shock. She opens her mouth slightly, then closes it. A step back. For the first time, uncertainty crosses her face. Kyle lowers the spear slightly, still holding onto it, his heart pounding. "I don't want to fight," he says, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. The warrior looks at him for a long moment, then slowly approaches. Her gaze isn't on Kyle's face, but rather, on the spear still clutched in his hands. When she reaches him, she drops to one knee, her head bowing in a gesture of respect, a silent, reverent moment that doesn't require translation. Kyle blinks, confused but intrigued. "I don't understand," he says softly, but she doesn't respond with words. Instead, she looks up at him, studying his face with new intensity. She places a hand on her chest, introducing herself, "Teresa." Kyle watches her, still unsure of what's happening, but the name resonates somehow. He doesn't know why, but it feels as though something has shifted, a connection that transcends words. Kyle lowers the spear, but his hands are still trembling slightly from the shock of the encounter. The warrior in front of him, Teresa, remains on one knee for a moment, her head bowed. He can feel the weight of the desert air pressing down on him, suffocating. There's a long, awkward pause. Teresa's golden eyes flicker up at him, still calculating, still wary. But she doesn't move. Instead, she simply gestures toward the horizon, a sweeping motion that includes the vast, open desert stretching out before them. Her voice, when she finally speaks, is low and deep. "Follow me." Kyle hesitates for a moment, eyeing her as she stands fluidly, the movement almost predatory in its grace. Her platinum white hair flows with every step, catching the desert light in an ethereal glow. He can't help but be drawn to her confidence, her presence. "Where are we going?" he asks, his voice cautious but curious. She doesn't answer him directly, instead continuing to walk. Her steps are light and sure, as if she's perfectly attuned to this alien world. Kyle, though, struggles to keep up. His muscles ache from the crash, and the constant sandstorms make everything feel heavy. The desert is a cruel teacher. He finally catches up to her as she stops by a rock formation. She places a hand against the stone, her touch gentle yet deliberate. For the first time, Kyle sees her in a slightly softer light, not as a warrior, but as someone who understands this world better than he ever will. Kyle looks at the stone, then back at her, clearly confused. "What is this place?" "Water," Teresa replies simply. Her eyes never leave the stone. She presses her palm flat, and Kyle watches as small tremors ripple through the ground. A low rumble follows, and the air shifts. A hidden oasis appears before them, a small, but lush patch of greenery in the midst of the desert. A small stream trickles through the rocks, and palm trees sway gently. Kyle is stunned. "How did you?" he trails off, but Teresa raises a hand to stop him. "It's not magic," she says softly, almost amused. "It's a part of the land, a gift from Karen." Kyle is in awe, stepping forward cautiously. "This is incredible." Teresa walks over to the water, kneeling and cupping her hands to take a drink. Kyle watches her, noting the smooth gracefulness of her movements. Her presence is something he can't quite put into words, but it's magnetic. There's strength in the way she moves, but also something unfathomably old. a deep connection to this place that he can't yet understand. He crouches beside her, dipping his hands into the water. The coldness of it surprises him, refreshing after the scorching heat of the desert. He takes a long, deep drink, savoring the sensation of water on his parched lips. "You don't trust me," Kyle says suddenly, breaking the silence. It's a statement, not a question. He feels it between them, the distance, the weariness. Teresa lowers her hands from the water, standing up slowly. She meets his gaze. There's a flicker of something in her eyes, but she remains silent for a long moment before speaking. "No," she says, "I don't trust you. You're kind." Kyle doesn't flinch at the words, but the weight of them hits him hard. "But you don't trust anyone," he says softly. "I can tell. You don't just trust anyone, do you?" She considers this, her gaze softening slightly. "I trust the desert," she says simply. "I trust Karen." Kyle lets the silence settle between them. There's a history in her words, a long, unspoken connection that runs deep. But they're not there yet. Not yet. "You want to survive," she adds, her voice steady and calm. "We need each other." Kyle nods slowly, understanding. "All right," he says, wiping his mouth. "Then let's make this work." The morning after their brief rest, Kyle awakens to the scorching heat of the Karen desert. The sandstorm has passed, but the environment is still unrelenting. Teresa is already awake, standing by a rock formation with a focused expression. Her platinum white hair catches the first light of the morning sun, and her golden eyes scan the horizon. Kyle stretches, feeling the aches of the previous day's crash and the exhaustion from the relentless desert. He stands up slowly, dusting himself off and adjusting the straps of his survival gear. When he looks up, Teresa is already walking ahead, her movements fluid and purposeful. "We need food," Teresa says without turning around. Her voice is calm and authoritative. "Follow me." Kyle follows, still unsure of what exactly she plans to hunt in this barren landscape. His feet sink into the sand with every step, but he doesn't complain. He knows he's lucky to have Teresa by his side. She may not trust him fully, but right now, they need each other. Teresa stops suddenly, her sharp eyes narrowing. Kyle slows, following her gaze. Ahead, he sees movement, something large moving across the dunes. At first, it looks like an alien creature, humanoid and armored, walking slowly toward a distant rock outcrop. "Stay quiet," Teresa whispers, crouching behind a large rock. Her spear is ready in her hands, her stance practiced and professional. Kyle crouches next to her, his heart beating faster. He follows her gaze and sees the creature up ahead. It's massive, covered in thick, jagged armor, with an air of dangerous elegance. Its movements are fluid, like that of a predator stalking its prey. "What is that?" Kyle whispers, his voice barely audible. Teresa doesn't answer. She's already moving, her feet light as she slips through the sand. Kyle follows her, trying to be as quiet as possible, but the sand is unforgiving, each step a struggle. He watches Teresa's graceful movements, her body strong yet delicate, a reminder of just how much she belongs here, in this alien world. Before Kyle can say anything else, Teresa holds up a hand, signaling him to stop. She raises her spear, eyes locked on the creature. "There's something worse coming," Teresa says under her breath, concern flickering across her face. Kyle is confused for a moment, but then he hears it, a low, guttural growl rising from beneath the sand. The ground starts to tremble, and Kyle turns to see a massive sand crawler emerging from the dunes. Its mandibles are enormous, and its body is covered in thick, barbed armor. It's heading straight for the alien creature. "This is bad," Kyle mutters. Teresa doesn't hesitate. She nimbly moves to the side, crouching behind another rock for cover. Kyle follows her, adrenaline kicking in. The sand crawler begins charging, its terrifying screech echoing across the desert. It's a massive creature, capable of crushing anything in its path. The alien creature in the distance doesn't seem to notice the danger yet, still moving toward the rock outcrop, completely unaware. Teresa quickly grabs a small, metallic device from her pouch and throws it toward the crawler. There's a sharp, high-pitched whine when the device hits the sand. The sand crawler veers sharply, confused by the sound, and retreats into the dunes, disappearing as quickly as it came. Kyle stares, his mouth slightly open in surprise. "What was that?" "Sonic disruptor," Teresa replies, her tone still calm, as though this was just another day in the desert. "It messes with their sensory organs. The effect is temporary." Kyle's eyes widen. "That was insane. Focus." Teresa's voice is sharp, her gaze moving back to the alien creature. "We need to get close." They move again, this time more cautiously. Kyle can feel his heart pounding as they approach the alien creature. The danger is real, but for the first time since he crashed on this planet, he feels like he's not alone. Kyle's confusion deepens, but before he can ask further questions, a loud roar echoes through the air. From the distance, something massive emerges, a sand crawler, a creature that looks like a cross between a crab and a spider, with long, razor-sharp legs and a monstrous maw. Kyle's eyes widen as he watches the crawler move toward the alien creature, its mandibles clicking ominously. The hunter is now being hunted. "We need to move, now," Teresa orders. Without another word, she turns and darts toward the rocks. Kyle is close behind, his feet sinking in the loose sand. The sand crawler is gaining ground, its body thrashing as it detects the vibrations in the air. Kyle can hear it screeching, and a wave of panic surges through him. Teresa suddenly stops and pulls out a small metallic device from her pouch. Distracted? Before Kyle can react, she hurls the device toward the sand crawler. There's a high-pitched whine when it hits the ground, and the creature veers sharply, its direction suddenly altered. It seems confused, disoriented by the sound. Kyle watches in awe. "What was that?" he breathes. "Sonic disruptor," Teresa explains, her voice calm despite the danger. "It disturbs their sensory organs. Just a temporary effect. It'll be back." The crawler hesitates for a moment before retreating into the dunes. Kyle breathes a sigh of relief, but Teresa doesn't slow down. She's already scanning the terrain for more threats. "Keep moving," she urges. "We're not safe here." Kyle follows her again, feeling the weight of the situation pressing in. He's still trying to make sense of everything: the alien creatures, the environment, and the woman who's somehow both dangerous and fascinating. He knows he can't survive this world without her, but the thought of trusting her fully still feels like a leap he's not ready to take. Kyle and Teresa continue across the shifting sands, their path winding through a series of jagged rock formations. The further they go, the more Kyle feels the weight of the world pressing down on him. The desert is both beautiful and cruel. But what unnerves him the most is the silence. The desert itself feels like it's watching them, as though it holds secrets that Kyle isn't sure he wants to know. "How much farther?" Kyle asks, his voice breaking the silence, though he's not entirely sure he wants to know the answer. Teresa's golden eyes flick toward him, her expression unreadable. "We're close." Her voice holds a strange finality, and Kyle doesn't question her. He knows she's leading them somewhere, he just doesn't know what that place is. But after everything that's happened, he's starting to realize that he doesn't have much of a choice but to follow her. As they reach a high ridge, Teresa stops abruptly, her posture suddenly tense. Her spear is gripped tightly in her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon once more. She turns to Kyle, her voice low. "Something's wrong." Kyle's pulse quickens, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "What do you mean?" "Something watches us," Teresa says, her tone firm, but with a touch of caution. "This world is full of things that hunt in the shadows. We've been followed." Kyle glances around, suddenly feeling a chill in the air. He hadn't noticed anything before, but now his instincts are kicking in. There's a feeling, a sense that something is watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Before he can respond, there's a sharp screech, a noise so high-pitched that it seems to vibrate in his skull. Teresa whirls around, her spear raised in a defensive position, her muscles taut. "Get down," she commands, pushing Kyle behind the nearest rock. Kyle drops instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. He watches as Teresa shifts, her focus entirely on the horizon, and then out of nowhere a blur of movement flashes across the rocks. Kyle barely has time to react before a creature not quite like anything he's seen before lunges from the shadows. It's fast, scaly, with multiple limbs and razor-sharp claws that scrape against the rock. Its eyes are bright red, glowing with an unnatural intensity. "What the hell is that?" Kyle exclaims, scrambling backward. Teresa's movements are swift and sure. She throws her spear in one fluid motion, the point striking the creature directly in its chest. The creature screeches, blood spraying from its wound. But it doesn't retreat. Instead, it's enraged, its ferocity escalating. Kyle is momentarily paralyzed by the intensity of the situation, but then, seeing Teresa's unwavering resolve, he jumps into action. He grabs a large rock and hurls it at the creature, momentarily distracting it. The creature swerves toward him, its claws extended, and Kyle is sure he's a goner. But before it can reach him, Teresa charges forward, grabbing her spear again and slamming it into the creature's side. It roars in agony, stumbling back. Finally, with a swift motion, Teresa twists the spear, driving it deep into the creature's skull. It lets out one final scream before collapsing to the ground in a heap. Silence falls over the desert once more. Teresa stands over the creature's body, her breathing steady, though the tension in her muscles remains. Kyle, still panting, slowly gets to his feet. His body is shaking, but it's not just from the adrenaline. "Nice shot," Kyle says, trying to keep his voice light, but his hands are still trembling. Teresa doesn't respond immediately. She wipes the blood from her spear, then glances back at him. "The desert is full of hunters, Kyle. Don't get too comfortable." She turns, as if expecting him to follow, and without another word, she moves deeper into the desert. Kyle watches her, feeling a strange mix of awe and respect for her. She's not just a warrior, but someone who has clearly survived this hellish world for much longer than he ever could have on his own. Kyle follows her, the adrenaline of the battle still coursing through his veins. His mind races with thoughts of what's to come next. This place is nothing like Earth. Everything is a fight for survival. But Teresa? She's not just surviving, she's thriving. As they continue their journey, Kyle begins to notice small, subtle changes in the way he feels. There's something about Teresa's presence that keeps him grounded. The way she moves through the desert, so sure of herself, so sure of the world around her. He doesn't fully understand her yet, but he's beginning to trust her. He has no choice. But as they keep moving, he can't shake the feeling that something is still watching them from the distance. Something that's much worse than the creature they just killed. The sun is high now, beating down relentlessly on the pair as they make their way through the endless desert. Kyle wipes the sweat from his brow, his eyes squinting against the heat. Teresa walks ahead, her movements fluid and efficient, a sharp contrast to his heavy, labored steps. The grit of the sand sticks to his skin, a constant reminder of just how alien this world is. It's nothing like Earth. And yet, despite the discomfort, he feels oddly drawn to Teresa, her confidence in this desolate place, her ability to adapt to the dangers of Karen. But there's something in her eyes today that Kyle hasn't seen before, a flicker of concern, a shadow behind her usual stoic exterior. It's small, barely noticeable, but it's there. He doesn't bring it up, though. He doesn't need to. Instead, he looks around, his gaze scanning the horizon. There's no sign of the alien creatures they've faced so far, but something still feels off. The air is too still, the usual sounds of the desert, the wind, the rustle of sand are strangely absent. Teresa, something's wrong, Kyle says, his voice low but filled with a growing sense of unease. His instincts are on high alert now, and they've been too quiet for too long. Teresa pauses, her body stiffening at the sound of his voice. She turns slowly to face him, her expression unreadable. But Kyle sees it, the brief flicker of something dark in her eyes. "I know," she replies, her voice tight. "We've been followed." Kyle's stomach drops at the words. He hadn't sensed anything, hadn't seen anything, but Teresa's perception of this world is far beyond his own. She knows when they're being watched. They keep walking, but the tension is palpable now. Kyle stays close, his every step heavy, his senses on high alert. He can't help but feel that something is hunting them just out of sight, just beyond the edge of his awareness. "Stay close," Teresa murmurs, her voice low, almost like a command. She holds her spear firmly, ready for whatever is out there. Kyle nods, following her every step. They don't speak, the silence thick with anticipation. Every step feels like it could be their last. Every sound, every movement in the desert could be a threat. After what feels like an eternity, they reach the base of a rocky ridge. Teresa moves with the grace of a predator, her eyes scanning the landscape, looking for the unseen enemy that she knows is there. Kyle, though, feels raw panic creeping up his spine. He's not used to this, being hunted, not knowing where the danger is. Suddenly, Teresa signals to him, her hand raised in a clear command to stop. Her golden eyes are locked onto something in the distance, far ahead. At first, Kyle sees nothing. Just rocks, sand, and the endless desert stretching out before them. But then, his eyes catch something, movement. A shadow, barely noticeable, slipping through the sand. It's fast, too fast for Kyle to track properly. Before he can say anything, Teresa is already moving forward, her spear raised, her body tense with purpose. It's here. Kyle follows her lead, but he's not fast enough. The creature strikes first, it's a blur, something incredibly fast, and before he can react, it's upon them. Its claws reach out, scraping against the rock as it leaps toward Kyle, its red eyes glowing with malevolence. Kyle barely manages to dodge, but only just. He stumbles backward, his heart racing. The creature's screech echoes through the desert as it turns to strike again, faster than Kyle can even think. But Teresa is already there. She moves like lightning, her spear flashing through the air with deadly precision. She slams it into the creature's side, forcing it back, but the creature doesn't retreat. It snarls and thrashes, its sharp teeth bared, its claws swiping dangerously. Kyle is on his feet now, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He has no idea how to fight this thing, but he can't just stand there. He grabs a rock, throws it at the creature's face, and it hits its target with a satisfying thud. The creature hesitates, but only for a second. Teresa, using the opening, shoves her spear deeper, piercing the creature's heart. It lets out one final screech before collapsing, its body twitching violently. For a moment, there is only silence. The tension that had been building over the past hours suddenly explodes, and Kyle realizes he's shaking. His body is still high on adrenaline, his mind trying to catch up with what just happened. Teresa pulls the spear free, her face impassive as she wipes the creature's blood off the blade. That was close. Kyle takes a deep breath, his hands trembling as he lowers the rock. I can't keep up with you. His voice is strained, a mix of admiration and frustration. He knows he's vulnerable in this world, and it's not easy to admit. Teresa doesn't respond right away. Instead, she glances at him, her eyes softening for a brief moment. You're learning. That's all that matters. Kyle looks at her, the tension between them momentarily easing. They've faced death together, and yet there's a strange sense of comfort in knowing that, for once, they are working as a team. But as much as he's starting to trust her, Kyle knows they're not out of danger. They stand there for a few more seconds, just catching their breath. But in the back of Kyle's mind, he can't shake the feeling that there's something even worse out there, something that has been watching them from the shadows. As the days pass, Kyle and Teresa continue their trek through the endless desert, always on the lookout for food, water, and shelter. The landscape of Karen seems endless, sweeping dunes, jagged rock formations, and a constant burning sky overhead. The air grows heavier, and the weight of isolation presses down on them both. Kyle's body aches from the constant walking, his muscles sore and his stomach growling with hunger. But there's something else gnawing at him, an unease, a sense of something lurking just out of reach. Teresa is more distant now, her usual focus sharp, but with a certain edge of tension that Kyle can't ignore. We need to find shelter soon. Teresa's voice is calm, but there's something in her tone that Kyle doesn't quite understand. He looks at her. Her platinum white hair blows in the wind, but there's a new tension in her posture. It's like she's holding something back, and for the first time, Kyle realizes that Teresa is not invincible. We will, Kyle replies, trying to keep his voice light. But I don't know how much longer we can keep going like this. I'm not used to walking for days on end. Teresa doesn't answer immediately. Instead, she stops and looks around, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain. There's a sense of urgency in her gaze now, and Kyle feels a chill run down his spine. Finally, Teresa speaks, her voice low and tight, we need to rest. They set up camp by a large outcrop of rocks. As the sun sets, the desert grows colder, and Kyle feels the chill sink into his bones. He watches Teresa move around their small camp, gathering what little food they've been able to scavenge. Are you okay? Kyle asks, trying to break the silence. He's not sure why he's asking, but something about her mood today has been different. It's like she's holding back something, and he can't shake the feeling that it has to do with their situation. Teresa doesn't look up as she stokes the fire, her movements sharp and almost too precise. "I'm fine." Kyle sits down beside her, the warmth of the fire comforting, though it can't chase away the coldness that has crept into their relationship. Teresa's distance is palpable now, and he feels it pressing down on him, like a wall between them. But Kyle doesn't let it go. He can't. "Not now. You're not fine." His voice is softer now, though there's an underlying frustration that he can't hide. "I know you're not. Something's wrong, Teresa." Teresa's gaze flickers to him, and for a moment, he sees something raw in her eyes. But it's gone in an instant, replaced by her usual impassive expression. "This place changes people," Teresa says finally, her voice quieter now. "I've seen it. I've lived it." Kyle frowns. "What do you mean?" Her lips press into a thin line. Her eyes never leave the fire, but there's a deep sadness in them now. "The desert, it doesn't forgive." She speaks as if the words are heavy, weighed down by something she's unwilling or unable to share. "It's not just about survival. It's about what you have to give up to survive here." The silence stretches between them, thick and heavy. Kyle feels something shifting in the air, an unspoken tension growing. This world, this harsh, desolate place has changed them both, and for the first time, Kyle realizes just how much it's shaped Teresa. He's beginning to understand that there's more to her than meets the eye. "And you," Kyle starts, but Teresa's voice interrupts him, hard and cold. "Don't." Her tone is firm, cutting him off. "Don't pretend you understand." The words sting, but Kyle doesn't back down. "I'm not pretending." He looks at her, a mix of frustration and understanding in his gaze. "But you don't have to shut me out." For a moment, Teresa says nothing. She simply stares into the fire, the silence thick between them. But then, unexpectedly, she speaks. "I had a brother once." Her voice is low, almost like a whisper. "He didn't survive. Neither did the rest of my people." Kyle sits up straighter, his heart heavy with the realization that there's more to Teresa than he ever knew. Her pain is palpable now, raw and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," he says quietly, the words feeling inadequate, but they're the only ones that feel right in this moment. For a long time, neither of them speaks. The crackling of the fire is the only sound in the night. Kyle feels the weight of Teresa's grief hanging in the air, and despite his own pain and weariness, he wants to reach out, to help her carry the burden she's been holding for so long. But he doesn't. After a long silence, Teresa finally looks at him, her eyes softening just slightly. "The desert takes everything. It doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It only cares about whether you can survive." Kyle swallows hard, the heaviness of her words sinking deep into his chest. He wants to tell her that he can help, that they can survive together, but he knows that survival here isn't that simple. Instead, he says, "We'll make it out of here. We have to." Teresa nods, her eyes flickering to the horizon. "We'll see." The night falls quickly on Karen, and Kyle can feel the temperature drop as they make camp again by the base of a large rock. The winds howl through the dunes, and for a moment, it almost feels like the planet itself is alive, breathing, shifting, waiting for the next move. Kyle stokes the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that settled in his chest. Teresa is sitting nearby, sharpening her spear with methodical precision, her movements mechanical, as if the weight of the world rests solely on her shoulders. Kyle's not sure what to say to her anymore. He's starting to realize that no matter how much he wants to help her carry her burden, he can't. This world has a way of turning everything upside down, of stripping away everything familiar. What happens if we don't make it out of here? Kyle asks, breaking the silence. His voice is hoarse, worn out from the journey and the constant heat. Teresa doesn't look up from her spear. We survive. The simplicity of her response is both comforting and disheartening. There's no doubt in her voice, just a quiet certainty. But Kyle knows her answer is a coping mechanism, a way of dealing with the grief and fear that's starting to bubble beneath the surface. But how long can we survive? Kyle presses, his voice edged with frustration. I mean, I've been here for days and I don't know if I'm making it through another one. You said we will make it out, but I don't know if I can keep going like this. Teresa's sharp eyes flick up to meet his, and for the first time in a long while, she softens. Her voice is quiet, but the weight behind it is unmistakable. You're not alone. We're not alone, Kyle. For a brief moment, Kyle almost believes her. He can see the sincerity in her eyes, the rare crack in her armor. But then the wind picks up again, carrying the desert's harsh whispers, and Kyle's doubt begins to creep back in. I didn't think I'd end up here, Kyle says, more to himself than to Teresa. He rubs his face, worn down by the relentless journey. Never thought I'd be on a planet like this. Alone. Struggling just to breathe. Teresa stands up, her movements deliberate as she moves to the edge of the camp, her back to Kyle. He watches her silently, sensing that something's about to shift between them. And then, the ground shakes. Kyle's heart skips a beat. The vibrations ripple through the sand beneath their feet, faint at first, but then growing stronger. It's as if the planet itself is trembling. He stands up immediately, adrenaline flooding his veins. His eyes lock onto Teresa, who has already grabbed her spear, her face suddenly stone-cold serious. What is it? Kyle asks, his voice strained. Not a sandstorm. Something bigger. Teresa replies, her eyes scanning the horizon. Before Kyle can react, the ground shakes again, harder this time. There's a roar, distant at first, but growing louder, more primal. Kyle's pulse races as the ground trembles beneath them. It's not a sand crawler, not anything they've encountered before. This feels different, darker, more destructive. And then they see it. A massive shape rises from the dunes, a creature of unimaginable size, its body like a towering sand dune, but with eyes that glow like molten lava. The carapace is a dark, rocky texture, covered in sharp ridges, and it moves with terrifying speed. The air grows heavy as the creature's guttural roar fills the desert, shaking Kyle to his core. Run! Teresa yells, her voice cutting through the chaos. But it's already too late. The creature charges toward them, faster than anything Kyle has ever seen. Teresa grabs Kyle's arm, pulling him forward, but the beast is already too close. They barely have time to think. The sand beneath their feet shifts and quakes with each step of the monster, its massive mandibles snapping with fury. Kyle feels the ground slipping beneath him, the sand giving way as they sprint. Kyle can feel his heart pounding in his chest, his legs burning from the effort. Teresa is ahead, effortlessly navigating the terrain, her sharp eyes always on the move. But Kyle can't help but feel like they're running towards certain death. The creature is too powerful, too relentless. We have to get to the canyon. Teresa shouts over her shoulder, urgency in her voice. It's the only place we can trap it? Kyle nods, pushing himself harder, willing his body to move faster. The sand crawler is gaining on them, its roar deafening as it gets closer. They're running out of time. As they near the canyon's edge, Kyle looks back. The creature is right behind them, its massive body looming, ready to strike. His pulse races, the weight of the situation settling in. He doesn't know if they'll make it. Just as the creature lunges, Teresa reaches the cliff edge and hurls her spear at the beast, aiming for its massive eye. The spear strikes true, but the creature doesn't stop. Instead, it lets out a blood-curdling scream, its rage intensifying. Now! Teresa commands, pulling Kyle toward a narrow ledge. Without thinking, Kyle follows her, his heart in his throat. The ground beneath their feet shifts again, and they barely manage to leap to safety as the creature crashes into the canyon walls, causing an avalanche of rocks to tumble down. Dust and debris fill the air, the sound of grinding stone echoing around them. They stand on the edge of the narrow ledge, gasping for breath, the creature's roars muffled by the rock slide. For a moment, everything is still. Kyle looks at Teresa, who is standing still, her expression unreadable. Then, her eyes meet his, and for the first time, she lets herself smile, the smallest hint of relief crossing her face. That was close. Kyle breathes out, his voice shaking. Teresa just nods, her smile fading as she turns back to the canyon. We've only delayed it. The real danger is still coming. The desert has become a living thing, a constant pressure in the back of Kyle's mind. Every step feels heavier now. The sand beneath their feet is no longer just a nuisance, it feels like a force they are constantly trying to escape. For days, they've moved in silence. The landscape is barren, and the harsh winds continue to carry a fine dust that cuts into their skin. Teresa's movements are swift, sure, and effortless, but Kyle feels like he's dragging himself across a world that's been designed to break him. But he's still here. He's still standing. And so is Teresa. They've reached a small outcrop of boulders, sheltering them from the winds, but there's no escape from the suffocating heat. The sun beats down relentlessly, casting everything in a bright, painful glare. The sandstorm earlier in the day had passed, but the tension still hangs thick in the air. Something is coming, a storm that's bigger than just the weather. We need to keep moving. Teresa's voice breaks the silence, sharp and commanding as ever. Kyle looks at her. Her figure, outlined by the sun, looks almost like a shadow of grace, her spear in hand, her eyes scanning the horizon. She's beautiful, in an otherworldly way. Her platinum hair glistens under the sun, but it's the intensity in her gaze that makes him feel small. The harsh desert world seems to have shaped her a warrior who can endure anything, someone who's always ready to fight. But today, something feels different. He's starting to see her as more than just a survivalist. Her walls are higher, more fortified than before. He can sense the burden she's carrying, and the weight she's hiding beneath her tough exterior. Teresa, stop for a second. Kyle catches her arm before she can move forward. She turns slowly, meeting his gaze. For a moment, she almost looks taken aback, as if she wasn't expecting him to speak. What's wrong? Teresa asks, her tone sharper than usual, but the undertone of exhaustion is unmistakable. Kyle hesitates. The tension between them has been growing, but it's not just the desert. Something deeper is stirring. He's seen glimpses of her vulnerabilities, and it scares him. He's starting to feel something he can't ignore. I think we need to talk. Kyle says quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Teresa's eyes narrow slightly, and for a moment, she looks ready to brush him off. But then, something shifts. She steps back, lowering her spear slightly, and her shoulders relax ever so slightly. Talk. About what? She sounds almost tired. Kyle's voice is low but determined. About this. About us. About everything that's been happening. Teresa's gaze flickers to the horizon, and Kyle watches her jaw tighten. She's holding something back, he can feel it in the way she tenses. But Kyle can't keep ignoring the connection between them, the way they're becoming more entwined in this alien world. Kyle, Teresa begins, her voice softer now, though the hardness is still there. We don't have time for this. But Kyle doesn't back down. He steps closer to her, his voice low but steady. I'm not talking about survival or the desert. I'm talking about us, Teresa. We've been through hell, and I don't know if I can keep doing this alone. For the first time, there's a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Teresa's guard cracks, just for a second, and Kyle sees it, the fear she's hiding, the vulnerability that she tries so hard to keep hidden beneath her tough exterior. I'm not alone. Teresa says, her voice a little softer now. I'm not alone with you, either. Her words hit Kyle like a ton of bricks. They are both surviving, but they've been surviving separately. He wants to be there for her, wants to be the one who helps her carry the weight of the desert, but he knows it's not that simple. And then, the ground shakes again, this time more violently. A deep rumble echoes from beneath the sand. What now? Kyle whispers, his pulse quickening. Teresa's eyes widen in recognition, and she pulls Kyle close, her hand gripping his arm tightly. Get to cover. Before Kyle can react, the earth erupts. A massive sandstorm, like a living wall of dust and debris, rises up from the desert floor. The force of it knocks them off their feet, the wind howling as it drives them toward the jagged rocks. Teresa pulls Kyle into the narrow crevice between two large boulders, sheltering them from the worst of the storm. The roar of the storm is deafening, and the world outside becomes a blur of sand and shadows. Kyle's heart races as he clings to the rock wall, trying to keep his bearings. And then, through the chaos, he hears it, the unmistakable roar of something massive coming from the distance. The creature they'd fought earlier? No, this is something bigger. The earth shakes beneath them as the beast nears, its roar shaking the very ground they're standing on. It's coming. Kyle yells, his voice barely audible over the storm. Stay down. Teresa snaps. She grabs his arm, pulling him closer to the rock wall. We have to wait it out. We can't face it head on. Kyle looks at her, his mind racing. They can't keep running forever. And the way she's acting defensive, almost afraid, makes him realize just how outmatched they are by this planet. The wind picks up, and the shifting sands outside create an eerie atmosphere. It's a waiting game now, survival, plain and simple. As the storm rages on, Kyle and Teresa huddle in the crevice. The silence between them speaks volumes. Kyle knows they're both afraid, but neither one of them says it aloud. The storm, the creature, the desert, all of it feels too much. And the silence between them is only broken by the growl of the approaching beast. We'll face it together, Teresa, Kyle says quietly, his voice full of determination. We'll survive. She looks at him, her golden eyes reflecting the fire of the storm, but there's something more in them now, trust. Just the slightest shift, but enough to make Kyle feel like maybe just maybe they'll make it out of this alive. The storm has passed, but the tension between Kyle and Teresa is palpable. The sandstorm has left its mark, and now, the desert feels like a vast, empty world where survival isn't guaranteed. Kyle and Teresa stand at the edge of a steep cliff, the horizon ahead blanketed in an eerie, orange glow as the sun begins to set. They've been running for what feels like days, no longer sure of their exact location. The creature they barely escaped is still following, drawn by the vibrations of their movement across the desert. Every footstep is a reminder that they are being hunted. Kyle glances at Teresa, who is still scanning the horizon, her golden eyes flickering with caution. She is no longer the stoic warrior he once admired from a distance. Her expression is sharp, tense, afraid. "We're cornered," Kyle mutters, his voice breaking through the thick silence between them. He's frustrated, exhausted, and yet, a part of him feels something stronger: hope. It's strange, considering the circumstances, but it's there. Teresa doesn't answer right away. She's been quieter than usual, and Kyle knows it's because she's starting to feel the weight of everything. Her gaze remains fixed ahead, her hand resting on the hilt of her spear. "We're not cornered," she says finally, her voice calm but laced with something deeper, something that Kyle can't quite identify. It's almost as if she's trying to convince herself more than him. Kyle watches her, the softness in her eyes standing in stark contrast to the usual sharpness. It's a look that says she's afraid, too, but she won't admit it. The realization hits him hard: she's just as scared as I am. "But we're running out of time," Kyle presses, stepping closer to her. "That thing is getting closer." "I know." Teresa's voice is barely a whisper. For the first time, Kyle sees her vulnerable, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Without a word, Teresa turns toward the cliff edge, her body tense, her eyes narrowed. She's waiting. Waiting for something to give. Kyle takes a breath and follows her lead, glancing behind them. The desert is empty, but the ground still vibrates from the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of the beast that has been hunting them for days. It's a reminder that danger is always close. Suddenly, a shadow crosses the cliff and Kyle knows it's the creature. It's close enough now that they can hear it, the sound of its massive mandibles clicking, its growl reverberating through the sand like a thunderstorm. "We fight." Teresa's voice breaks the tension like a snap of a whip. "This is the only way." Kyle looks at her, not sure what to say. Part of him wants to argue, but the look in her eyes is enough to silence him. She's made up her mind. They don't have any more time for decisions. "We can't outrun it anymore," Teresa continues, stepping toward the cliff's edge. "So we'll face it head on." Kyle looks at her, hesitation in his gaze. "But how? We barely survived before. How are we supposed to take that thing down? Together?" Teresa's response is firm, and as she looks at him, her expression softens just a touch. "We'll use everything we've learned. Everything we have." For a moment, Kyle is silent. His mind races through everything they've done, every scrap of survival instinct, every fight. He trusts her, but this is different. This is a last stand. The sound of the creature's footsteps grows louder. Kyle's heart starts to pound in his chest as the ground trembles beneath their feet. He looks at Teresa, then back to the horizon. There's no more time for hesitation. "Let's do it," Kyle says, the resolve in his voice steady now. He's made his decision. Teresa nods once, her eyes gleaming with purpose. They're in this together. In a flash, Teresa grips her spear, and with unmatched precision, she begins to set up traps along the cliffside. She moves quickly, her body flowing with practiced ease. Kyle can only watch, trying to match her pace, even as his mind races. How do they even stand a chance? The creature is almost upon them now, its form slowly becoming visible through the rising dust. It's massive, towering over them. Its eyes are glowing, a sickly yellow, scanning the landscape. "Do you have a plan?" Kyle asks, his voice tense. His pulse is racing. "I always have a plan." Teresa replies, her lips curling into a faint smile, but there's a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The creature is now just a few yards away, its massive claws scraping the ground, leaving deep grooves in the sand. It's so close Kyle can feel the heat radiating off its body. Without warning, the creature lunges, its jaws snapping, heading straight for them. "Now!" Teresa shouts, her voice filled with command. Kyle barely has time to react as Teresa pulls him toward the trap. The sand beneath their feet shifts, and suddenly, the ground gives way beneath the creature's massive feet. It falls into the pit, trapped. Kyle watches as the beast thrashes, struggling to escape, but the boulders and sand have already trapped it. The sheer force of the fall sends shockwaves through the ground. "It's not over yet," Teresa says, moving toward the edge, her spear raised. "We need to finish this." Kyle stands at her side, ready to do whatever it takes. The creature struggles, but it's clear now, they have it cornered. This is their last chance. With one final, decisive strike, Teresa slams her spear into the creature's heart, sending a pulse of energy through its body. The creature lets out a final, deafening screech, its body going still. The desert falls silent again. The sky above them is a dull shade of red, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert floor. Kyle and Teresa stand at the edge of the great chasm, looking out over the barren land that has both broken and shaped them. The sandstorm from earlier has passed, but it's still an unrelenting world. The beast they've just defeated lies still behind them, its massive form sinking into the sand. Kyle's breathing is labored, his body sore from the battle, the journey, and the endless days in the desert. But there's something else now, a deep, unshakable feeling in his chest. It's not just exhaustion, it's relief. They've survived. Against all odds, they made it through. And more than that, they did it together. "It's over," Kyle mutters, almost to himself. Teresa doesn't respond right away. She stands next to him, her posture still strong, but Kyle notices the subtle slump in her shoulders, the exhaustion in her face. For the first time, she looks as though she's allowed herself to feel the weight of what they've been through. "Not yet." Teresa's voice is quiet but steady. "It's not over until we're off this planet." Kyle nods, understanding the reality. The battle with the creature may be over, but Karen still holds dangers, and they still have a long way to go before they're safe. But there's something in the way Teresa looks at him now, something softer. For a moment, she's not just the warrior. She's Teresa. "Do you think we'll make it off this hellhole?" Kyle asks, a small, ironic smile playing on his lips. His words are laced with exhaustion, but his voice is warmer now, the frustration from earlier gone. Teresa turns to him, her golden eyes meeting his. She stands taller now, more assured than she's been in days. There's a quiet strength in her gaze, and Kyle realizes how much she's grown throughout this journey, how much they've both grown. "If anyone can make it out of here, it's us," Teresa says, the confidence returning to her voice. We've learned from the desert, Kyle. We've learned from each other. There's a long silence between them. The desert stretches out, vast and unforgiving, but Kyle no longer feels alone. For the first time, he feels like they truly have a chance not just to survive, but to escape. Together. We've learned a lot, haven't we? Kyle says, his voice low. Teresa nods, turning her gaze back toward the horizon. More than I ever thought I could. She looks at him again, her eyes softening. The distance that had once existed between them seems to be slowly melting away. Kyle can see it now, the depth in her eyes that speaks of everything she's been through, of everything she's survived. We've changed, haven't we? Kyle says, his voice softer now. All this time. I never thought we'd get this far. Teresa finally allows herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Her eyes are focused, but there's a flicker of something deeper, something real between them. I used to think the desert was the hardest thing I'd ever face. But now I know it's not the land we fight against. It's what's inside us. Teresa's words are quieter now, almost as if she's speaking to herself as much as to Kyle. Kyle stares at her for a long moment, understanding dawning on him. They've both been through so much physical pain, mental exhaustion, the fear of losing everything. But they've come out stronger. Together. Teresa, Kyle says, his voice full of admiration, I think we've become something more than just survivors. For a brief moment, their eyes meet, and the connection between them is undeniable. The journey that started with strangers on a hostile alien world has turned into something profound. They are no longer just surviving the desert, they've become part of it, in a way. They've become each other's anchor. A soft wind blows through the desert, and for the first time in a long time, the air feels almost peaceful. It's as if the planet itself has accepted them. They've conquered it, together. I don't know what happens after this. Kyle says, his voice quiet, almost contemplative. But I'm not leaving without you. Teresa's eyes flicker with something gentler, a warmth that hasn't been there before. You're not getting rid of me that easily. For the first time since their crash, Kyle feels at peace. No more fighting. No more survival. They're here now, together. And they're ready for what comes next. Whatever it is. In the final moments, when the space between us shrank to nothing, and the stars above us watched in silence, I realized one thing: love doesn't need to make sense. It doesn't need to follow the rules of the universe. It just is. Sometimes, love is the force that holds everything together, even when it shouldn't. Even when the universe is against us, we are still here. Together. But what happens next? Can we keep going forward? Or is this just a fleeting moment, destined to fade into the vastness of space, just like everything else? We've faced the monsters, the storms, the unbearable loneliness. But love, like the stars, never truly dies. Will they survive in a world that doesn't want them? Or will their love become the very thing that saves them? What would you do for love if it meant defying everything? Would you sacrifice it all, or would you be willing to take the leap no matter the cost? If you're still here, still thinking about what comes next, don't let this journey end. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave your thoughts below. You are witnessing something that will change the way you see love and the universe itself. Let's discover together how far love can stretch across the stars. And remember, the first 1,000 subscribers will be part of this exclusive journey, the ones who truly understand what it means to follow love across galaxies.